if we are not really aggressive in making sure that our cultures are known, are respected, are appreciated by all the other people, by the way we portray our own cultures, being forceful, not forceful, but aggressive, show our own cultures, for them to know that we are proud of our own culture. The more it's appreciated, the more our children would learn.
I've spent a large part of my life studying Africa. Africa is, for me, the soul. It's where it all began as we look at this question of just general humanity. Africa has a splendid beauty that has to be experienced.
With enlightenment came the agitation of self-rule, and Africans began to revolt against colonization. Africans leaders like Ghana's Kwame Nkrumah, Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, Nigeria's Nnamdi Azikiwe, South Africa's Nelson Mandela, Namibia's Sam Nujoma, and several others were at the forefront of the fight for independence. One by one, African countries gained their freedom, and at present, all 54 countries in Africa, apart from the Western Sahara, are free from colonial rule and are once more running their own show. The centuries have recorded a lot of changes for the continent of Africa. There has been some false starts and missteps, victories and defeat, but generally, mostly positive. The continent, by all indices, appears to be on the right track. From the stables of the publishers Echoes Africa magazine comes your favorite TV show, Echoes from the Valley. African story like you've never seen it.
To many of these folks, they see Africa as just one country.
And the woman came to me and she goes, so what color is the flag? I said, what flag? She said, the flag of Africa. I was like, oh my God. I'm like, do I now educate this woman, or do I just tell her and move on?
Recorded in locations across Africa and diaspora, it is Africa from African perspective.
These fellows invaded Africa without visas, without passports. And what about? About resources.
Echoes from the Valley on AIT, Saturdays at 7:30 a.m. It is time to tell the true African story. Present your own truth.
They are working in our psychology as Africans.
That they don't understand that it was sensationalized for, marketing purposes. But that's exactly why I think people have a misconception of Africa and African people.
That conversation about who's the most African, we're really spending a lot of time on something that really is not that significant. What's significant is what we do.
As governments, as individuals, we have got to tell our stories.
What is your African story? What is your origin and the history? What makes your culture and tradition unique? What are your milestones? Echoes from the Valley on Africa Independent Television, AIT. For sponsorship, participation, and advert details, please call the numbers on your screen. Echoes from the Valley, telling the African story.
If you look at the national growth of each country in Africa, if you look at stability also in Africa, Africa used to be the continent of political crisis, military coup, etc., and we've been witnessing successive political and army crises in Africa. Now Africa is learning from its past mistakes, and stability is except in just few countries. Africa is learning how to stabilize.
Sadly, this is not reflected in the news reportage of the continent, though all of Africa is lumped as one, so much that large majority of people across the globe, including the seemingly educated, believe that Africa is one country.
At the United Nations, I had to take up this thing with one of the directors of UNDP. When he was making a presentation, he mentioned some obscure country, town in Eastern Europe, mentioned another one in town in France, and then said when they went to Africa. So I had to go to him and say, excuse me, I don't even know this town in Eastern Europe that you've mentioned. Population maybe 20,000. The other one in France. And then you come to a whole continent of 54 countries. You say Africa. Was it East? West? You couldn't even give us a geographical location. And I do remember he apologized and said, you know, it was, he hadn't thought about it, but it's a battle I have fought. I even remember we went to NATO once and they had a course and they had somebody lecturing the whole course group and mentioned Africa. So I had to ask him, excuse me, have you ever been to Africa? And he had to confess no. So I was, then how, sorry, it wasn't NATO, it was the EU. Yes, and I was like, why would you then presume to lecture a whole set of diplomats from multiple countries on a continent you've never been to?
I think this was in Brussels or the Netherlands. We were introduced, you know, when we just was to arrive, we were at a function, and we were introduced as coming from Nigeria, Africa, and somebody screamed, "Oh, I have some friends in Africa. They live in Nairobi. Do you know them?" I said, "Oh yes." I said, "I actually saw them 2 days before we left." And my wife looked at me. "Can you say a thing like that?" I said, "She's very stupid." I said, "I'm from Nigeria. You're telling me if I knew somebody in Nairobi."
I went to college in a very small liberal arts school, and I was the president of the African Student Association, and we're having this big gala, and we asked the catering department to make a cake for us. And the woman came to me and she goes, "So what color is the flag?" I said, "What flag?" She said, "The flag of Africa." I was like, oh my God. I'm like, do I now educate this woman, or do I just tell her and move on? So I didn't have the time to educate her, but I told her, I was like, Africa is not one country and we don't have a unifying flag. And she was like, "So what are the colors?" She wanted one thing to define Africa, and that's an example of like, one thing doesn't define Africa. Africa is too big to be lumped into one category or to put into one box. So that's like one of many experiences I've had with people trying to make Africa one entity instead of like the different things that it is.
Why do they have this impression of Africa?
I guess maybe they're just looking at a map and they're just seeing, you know, the continent of Africa, and maybe they think of it as a country. I don't know why they don't think that other places in Africa, other countries actually make up Africa. I have no idea. I mean, you know, Senegal, Ghana, I don't know why they are. I wonder what they hear when they hear the names of those countries, where they think they are. I don't know. That really is, it is odd. Maybe it's just a lack of geography or a lack of history.
That mindset is still there about the old Africa, where they think everybody is the same. And bear in mind that our post-colonial history, it's not really that too attractive when you look back. You know, it was the gains of independence, the expectations of a post-independent Africa virtually collapsed as a result of civil wars, coups and counter-coups. We became a basket case. We became least developed country. You know, we formed the bulk of the least developed country in the world. A number of the nations depended on aid from the West. Stories of killings, massacre, you know, so many other things. You know, let's not forget, for example, the so many wars that up to the 90s, you know, you had Ethiopia, you had the crisis in Rwanda, you had Sierra Leone, you had Liberia, and these were brutal wars. There was also the civil war in Nigeria. So it created a very poor image of the continent. It created a picture of a hopeless region. And there was this worry that this was an albatross that the West has to carry for a long time because, you know, to some extent, they created some of these countries and so on. But the good news is that things are beginning to change.
I think ignorance, people just don't know better. People don't want to know better. It's not even that they don't know, they don't want to know better. And this, you know, single story narrative, Chimamanda Adichie, one of my favorite authors, she talks about the single story, the dangers of a single story. So this single story narrative of this is what Africa looks like, and people just don't care to learn more. They just hear the single story and that's all they really care about.
For me, it's their problem. You can't, what you've said, I've had somebody ask me, do you have pretzels in Africa? And one of the countries I was in, somebody said to me, I always wear home clothes as part of my job, and the woman who was a manager in a very good store said to me, oh, you're from Africa? I said, there is no such place. She said, you're not from Africa? I said, it's a continent. So she said to me, oh, so where are you from? I said, do you see a white person and say, are you European? Don't you say, are you French? Mm-hmm. Are you German? Your Mandela story takes the back position when I tell you, she asked me, is Germany in Africa? With that, I stopped speaking because there was no need to continue the conversation.
That's definitely literature. I mean, and you can see it. I mean, literature written by, let's say, a white writer, especially in the 1800s, they are going to sensationalize, you know, some like place that it's dark and mysterious, it's far away. You know, it has, you know, people who are very sort of mysterious, with strange names. And I think that people get that opinion that this is the truth, that they don't understand that it was sensationalized for, you know, marketing purposes. But that's exactly why I think people have a misconception of Africa and African people. That it is just from what they read, that they don't bother researching it, they don't do their own research, they don't speak to people. Like we said before, some people are very insular and, you know, they insulate themselves, isolate themselves, and they just don't reach out.
Meeting and forming a personal opinion about people based on your interactions with them is a key to getting to know them. Maureen Haggerty found this out in a personal experience with Africans.
Very, very generous people, very generous. I also told you the story of when I was on my kola nut expedition myself. Here I am on the internet looking for kola nut. Couldn't find it. I could find something about it, but I couldn't find where to buy it. Maybe I was looking in the wrong place. And I happened upon this restaurant, Buka in Brooklyn, and I said to my husband, oh, you have to drive me there. And I get out, I rush into the restaurant, and the bartender was there, and I said, listen, I need to find some kola nut. Do you know where I can find it? And it was really strange how this happened. And she said, one moment, please. And she spoke to the proprietor, and he came out. And she must have told him that I wanted some kola nut. How I knew they would have it, because I asked him, I asked the bartender, do you know where I can find it? And she must have told him. And he came out with a bag of kola nut, and he gave me the bag of kola nut, and I went to pay him, and I said, I have to pay you. How much do I owe you? And he said, no, this is for you. This is from and he said, my private stash, and he gave it to me, and I said, I couldn't believe it, because he just gave it to me. I just walked in his restaurant. He doesn't know me. We weren't on a, first name basis. I'm a stranger. And I walked into his shop and he gave me something. I said, that is just so generous. I mean, right there, that example, it's generous. And African people, they love to tell you stories. They're very proud of where they come from. They're very proud of their families. So they're very, very, very open, very, very giving, very friendly.
From the stables of the publishers Echoes Africa magazine comes your favorite TV show, Echoes from the Valley. African story like you've never seen it.
So many of these folks, they see Africa as just one country.
And the woman came to me and she goes, so what color is the flag? I said, what flag? She said, the flag of Africa. I was like, oh my God. I'm like, do I now educate this woman or do I just tell her and move on?
Recorded in locations across Africa and diaspora, it is Africa from African perspective.
These fellows invaded Africa without visas, without passports. And what about? About resources.
Echoes from the Valley on AIT, Saturdays at 7:30 a.m. It is time to tell the true African story. Present your own truth.
They are working in our psychology as Africans.
That they don't understand that it was sensationalized for, marketing purposes. But that's exactly why I think people have a misconception of Africa and African people.
That conversation about who's the most African, we're really spending a lot of time on something that really is not that significant. What's significant is what we do.
As governments, as individuals, we have got to tell our stories.
What is your African story? What is your origin and the history? What makes your culture and tradition unique? What are your milestones? Echoes from the Valley on Africa Independent Television, AIT. For sponsorship, participation, and advert details, please call the numbers on your screen. Echoes from the Valley, telling the African story. Changing people's preconceived notion is difficult, but not impossible. Getting the world to see Africa and Africans differently is doable, once there is a clear, defined goal in mind.
We actually are the originators of this negative publicity, number one. Number two, the same people who create half of this negativism, they have also not paid attention to developing the instruments that will enable them project their country into the rest of the world. Look, we in this country claim, and it's true, at the time television came to this country, which was in 1958, in the Western region, and we were there then, most parts of the world had no television. In fact, I believe AIT, if I'm not wrong, I believe AIT came on stream before Al Jazeera, if I'm not mistaken. I believe AIT came on board before Al Jazeera. See where Al Jazeera is, see where AIT is. So if you do not have this platform, who is going to tell your story?
What can be done to change the narrative?
What the African, at all levels, average, whatever, the responsibility remains the same. One is to understand our history, because it's said, if you don't know where you are coming from, you never know where you are going, leave alone where you are now. So I would really want that the Africans, either in the continent or in the diaspora, we need to find one another. In terms of engaging into positive discussions of our continent. So wherever we are, whether it's within the family, within the community, professional, anyway, we should talk about the Africa we want. In fact, that is the theme of Agenda 2063, the Africa we want. We know where we are coming from, but what do we want now? So by empowering, let us decolonize ourselves and not to become a laughing stock to our opponents who are now feeling the fear that Africa is a lion that is walking up. And if this lion now walks up, how are we going to survive? Because the resources we are used to, we can no longer access them in the way we wanted to. So I really want the Africans, whether in the continent or in the diaspora, to engage one another in a very positive discussion to empower one another. Where we can, we should also invest economically. So, because we are talking about industrialization of the continent. In 2063, we want Africa to be an industrialized continent. So bring money, invest here. You can be wherever you are, but bring your operation to the continent. And innovation, let us engage so that we discover what can we innovate so that it can be truly African. So this is really, it's engagement, it's investment, and to be positive to ourselves and to decolonize our minds.
I really think people like me who definitely have this Nigerian side and have pride in being African, but also have pride in being American, like we are the ones that can change this narrative. And I know, you know, some people I come across, they want to deny their African side, their Senegalese side, their Ghanaian side, whatever side they have, and they want to just be American. But I think like we're the ones that are going to change the narrative, the Africans who are either born and raised or just raised abroad. We're the ones that can really change the minds of people, show them, not even by talking, by showing them like this is who Africa is, like this is who Africa can be, by the way we act, by the way we live, the accomplishments that we have. So I think we're definitely the ones that can change the narrative, but we have to want to. And I don't know how many African-born Americans or Englishmen or anyone want to do that, want to take on the burden. It's a burden when people look to you to define Africa, or people look to you to represent Africa. It's a big burden, but I think it's something that we can do. I'm currently a dean at a high school in the Bronx, and something I actively do, there are a lot of Africans in my school who were born in America or just raised in America. And I teach them, or try to teach them, to embrace that side of them. When someone's making fun of them, calling them, there's so many different things. You're so black, you're so dark, when they turn off the light, you can't see you. Or, you know, African booty scratcher, like, for lack of a better term. But so many different things about being African that are so negative. Instead of laughing at it as a joke, correcting them and saying, you can't call me that, you can't talk about me like that, or talk about my people like that. I think like teaching the younger ones to take pride in the culture and take pride in where their parents came from. Maybe they haven't been there yet, but taking pride in what their parents came from, I think would definitely help. So I always, when people ask me where am I from, I always say Nigeria. You know, I haven't been there in 20 years, but I always say Nigeria because that's where my family is from. I can never let go of that. Like, that is where my family's from. The household I grew up in, although it was in America, it was very much Nigerian. So definitely like showing by example how I take pride in my culture, and teaching the ones that are like me, that look like me, to take pride in their culture. So people don't just go off and say certain things and they just, you know, laugh at it. It's not a joke. It's not funny. This is who I am. You shouldn't laugh at that.